the more I think about this show, is the more I only talk about the holiday traditions of this episode does. Like the Christmas episode, that True Colors, which is a Black History Month episode, and the Halloween episode. For so many times I ever get back to the show, it's mainly about holidays episodes, mainly because I really don't think I have the interest into reviewing other episodes from this show. More mainly the fact that they don't give a lot of views and stuff like that. But considering that this is Summerpalooza 2, and I'm gonna do something interesting with so many uploads for this month, I decided to review an episode that isn't a holiday special episode for once. And that is When There's Smoke. Now, Victor completely leaves Chloe and Raven alone, and this is also the final episode of That's So Raven. And it came out in November of 2007, which was around the time Chloe in the House first season came to an end, and before the second season of Chloe House premiered. I really don't know what's going on with Disney Channel's premiering, but I guess they know something that I don't. Cindy, which is Chloe's girlfriend in the show, completely is invited to his house only to reveal that she's been smoking. And this episode is mainly about how smoke is a bad thing, and the fact that Cindy is obviously one of those stereotype people who completely does things and just not understanding the situation or what's going to happen with their human body. I know Cindy actually appeals more in this show, but considering of how she's portrayed in this, I guess that statement is mostly true. Besides, this show has so many stereotypes that they're just trying to make them work in order to make this episode work with those stereotypes. Now, Chloe completely takes the cigarettes away from Cindy just to make sure that nothing bad will ever happen, because smoking is really not a good thing, but considering the fact that Raven completely saw a cigarette in Chloe's pocket after he completely didn't do his chores, Chloe completely says that he will never smoke and he never will. Which leads to the final vision Raven has in this show before Raven's home. She has a vision that Chloe is hiding cigarettes in his room, and so she investigates into finding cigarettes from Chloe's room, despite the fact that his room is completely messy, despite the fact that he just said that he was going to clean it up, but he lied. And as for the other half of this episode, they're about to have an important meeting with several other friends, just trying to help Chloe to not do any more smoking, despite the fact that he never smoked, like I mentioned earlier. This episode being the final episode of That's So Raven isn't really much of a finale, because this show didn't actually have an opening when it comes to its first episode. If there's one thing that this episode does when it comes to the final episode, is that it's all taking place in the Baxter's home instead of somewhere else, because there's so many locations that Raven and his friends and family have gone to the point that I'm actually kind of surprised they actually did all of this and completely use each set for one episode. Sure, other sitcoms like iCarly does that, but considering the fact that That's So Raven completely has so many ideas by going to so many different places, it actually makes me believe that all the budget is just trying to actually do some variety into places and ideas of what they can do, despite the fact that this show is cliched. Getting back to the characters, I honestly think that the motivations in this episode is honestly basically what they do with every other episode, but they're not mean or over the top like I've seen from other shows. But it is kind of sad that we're not going to see these characters again until Raven's home. Well, mainly Raven, Chelsea, and Victor. As for the plot of this, considering the fact that this is mainly about smoking and how you should never smoke, it's really obvious that the second half of this episode is just basically a lesson that we need to learn about not smoking in general. If you really ask me, I honestly think that everything else in this episode involving smoking is just basically the last thing that this show can do before it just ends off and continuing on to do other things. Because I honestly think that they probably did so many ideas, but they couldn't do enough like new ones for a newer season, because Disney Channel sitcoms only last for 4 seasons, kind of like a high school year, like you're becoming a freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and then you're all done. That's basically what this is all about. And considering that Cindy is in this just to show that she's really into smoking. I haven't smoked before, but what Cindy's been through, I don't want to be in her footsteps whatsoever. I may never smoke, and I also never drink, but at the same time, I will probably not do any of that kind of stuff because I honestly don't know why it's cool to begin with. People say that those types of situations involves addiction and stuff like that, which I do understand, but I honestly think that that's basically what this show can do for its final episode. It's not an issue, but I've seen other episodes from this show that did a lot more better lessons than this, and this was a good lesson, but with this being the final episode for the show in general, is honestly mostly a letdown. Like I said earlier, that this doesn't need to be a finale, but with this mainly about smoking, I think that this final episode could have done a lot more better than what we've got instead. This episode will put in a lot more better if it actually happened a few episodes ago. So anyway, let's go talk about Waven's final appearance in her show, since that this is the final episode. And I do not qualify her appearance from Cory in the House since that episode came out months before this episode premiered. Unlike most episodes when it actually involves her and her sassy attitude and the fact that she doesn't know what's going to happen next because she doesn't think ahead most of the time, in this episode, she takes mostly responsibility in actually thinking ahead because she's in charge of the house because his father is completely out of the house. And the fact that Cory isn't doing all of his chores correctly because of what Waven saw involving not getting fresh milk, not completely taking care of the laundry, and cleaning up his room, really shows that this is the type of behavior Waven doesn't accept from Cory, which I do understand because Waven is getting older despite the fact that in Waven's home she remains the same. But we didn't know that there was going to be a spin-off show nearly almost 10 years after this episode premiered. As for her friends in this final episode, they really don't do much since that this is all taking place in the Baxter's home. Waven's father completely made a casserole for the male's birthday banquet, and Eddie and Chelsea couldn't resist how good it is, so they end up eating it, making it again, eating it again, and then make it a third time. But apparently third time just isn't a charm because the juicer, Cory's bully in this season, just ends up eating it and they have to make it a fourth time. This subplot really doesn't have anything meaningful for this episode. They just want to have Chelsea and Eddie do something, and I honestly understand. I've watched this episode when I was little, and I can honestly think that this comedy was funnier, but at the same time, I've seen much more funnier stuff than this. So I really don't know what else to believe other than the fact that they don't know what to do with Chelsea and Eddie in this. But I will say that it's probably a great way to actually have them at least just have some kind of a purpose in this episode, since that this is the final episode. Besides, they're all part of the intervention about smoking, so I honestly think that subplot actually does fit between the intervention for the most part. So, as for the intervention itself, it's mostly a misunderstanding because we all know that Cory doesn't smoke whatsoever. So I honestly think that the intervention itself was pretty good for what it is. By the way, when I actually saw the juicer completely squeeze the cigarettes, I actually thought that was actually real, but apparently sitcom logic can actually happen on TV too, not just cartoon logic. I should probably talk about Cory before I wrap up this review. And since that this was premiered between his spin-off show, it's honestly difficult to actually see him act like this until how he behaved in Cory in the House. I understand that this is Disney Channel's sitcom material we're talking about, but whenever I see Cory like this, you will probably see that he's becoming a little bit more mature, but in Cory in the House, I'm sorry, I can't take him seriously. I mean, sure, it isn't, that show isn't terrible. In fact, it's a great anime by memes and people everywhere, but I honestly think that this episode, where we actually see him behave, and how he really doesn't react, and how he acts differently in Cory House, really makes his appearance in this episode mostly desperate for having That's So Raven to continue in some other way. I know that's not the best explanation I can actually think of, but by this time, Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, Hannah Montana, and Wizards of Waverly Place that just premiered, just around this episode premiered, they probably want the That's So Raven world continuing on, despite the fact that Cory in the House ended in 2008, which wasn't a year after this episode premiered. I really have mixed opinions about this episode alone, but that just really goes to show that every other That's So Raven episode isn't really like iCarly or Hannah Montana, to be quite honest. I really think that this show, for how it ended off, is just basically one of the final Disney Channel classics of the 2000s, since that we have Hannah Montana and the other shows to keep us occupied for Disney Channel. If this show actually did have a 5th season, it will probably become way more repetitive, because people say that the characters get franchise, and the fact that if we get a 4th, we actually get more seasons of Disney team sitcoms, they will probably go through the same category of what Nickelodeon sitcoms are like in Nickelodeon. But that's something I will talk about when I review Nickelodeon sitcoms in my Nickelodeon reviews. I give this episode a 7 out of 10.